Welcome to the Talent Equation Podcast. If you are passionate about helping young people to unleash their potential and want to find ways to do that better, then you've come to the right place. The Talent Equation Podcast seeks to answer the important questions facing parents, coaches, and talent developers as they try to help young people become the best they can be. This is a series of unscripted, unpolished conversations between people at the razor's edge of the talent community who are prepared to share their knowledge, experiences, and challenges in an effort to help others get better faster. Listen, reflect, and don't forget to join the discussion at thetalentequation.co.uk. Enjoy the show.
Well, delighted again. Well, it's interesting. I say again. Delighted to be joined by John O'Sullivan, otherwise known as Coach Johnny O, who has been on the podcast, but by my reckoning, never as an individual guest, which is massively overdue. Anyway, John, welcome back.
Stuart, thanks, man. And I would have to say, in your defense and mine, we did do this like a year and a half ago, and the recording blew up.
That's true.
Like yours didn't work and mine didn't work, and so we had to scrap it, and then we've just never found the time to do it again.
Which is a travesty. But anyway, we're here now, which is good. Yeah. I get a starting point. Hey, I think you need no introduction, but just in case there's people out there who have been living in a cave or maybe aren't as able to access the World Wide Web, or maybe they're based over here in the UK and don't look across the pond, tell the world all about you and your mission, I guess.
Sure. And my preemptive apology to everyone as this interview goes along. I just finished a whirlwind speaking trip to Beijing and Sydney and then back to the States, and finally all the travel caught up with me, and I kind of was losing my voice last night. So I have in front of me water and a coffee and Chloraseptic, which is for sore throats. So I'm going to do my best to keep my voice going after 75 hours of airplanes. But yeah, so I run an organization called Changing the Game Project. That I started, God, it's going on, 7 years or something now, after a couple decades of coaching. And I coached at the youth level, high school level, university level here in the States. I'm a football guy or a soccer guy, but coached a bunch of sports as my kids grew up as well. So through Changing the Game Project, we do a lot of coach education, parent education, leadership development work with sporting organizations all around the world. So like Stu, I first met you. I was working for PADSIS over there, all the independent schools in the UK. But yeah, I just got back from working with Rugby League in Australia. I've worked with Aussie Rules Football over there, worked with a lot of the US sport governing bodies, really working outside of the not just the X's and O's of sport, but what really is coaching and the things that you talk about on your podcast. I mean, I'm an avid listener, a weekly listener on my bike rides. I always look forward to the new episodes because that'll always get me through a long uphill. And so I usually listen to the podcast on the way up. And so when you get really long ones, I'm like, oh, Stu, you're killing me this week, man. Now I got to ride further.
That's making me think of. I'm going to think about that now when I'm like getting into the sort of second hour, and I'll be like,
when you're getting into the second hour, just think that's another 1,000 vertical feet I got to do.
So you came to, I guess, everybody's attention really, because of the TED Talk you did, and in many ways, I guess, I think Changing the Game had been going before that, but it probably took Changing the Game project maybe into a different realm, different place. But the thesis of that conversation, I think, was really, that talk, I think, was kind of really, like, at the time, and I think still very very relevant now, but at the time was like, I think it touched a nerve. It seemed anyway, because it went pretty viral. But anyway, I mean, just talk about that and how did it come about, and also a bit about what what your kind of central message was.
Yeah, sure. So I started Changing the Game Project after writing my first book, which was called Changing the Game. And that was really sort of like a guide for parents and coaches, but, to look at the mindset of the kids that you're coaching. And so how to make sport enjoyable and give sport back to kids while also helping your children do well. And so out of that came this TED Talk in 2014. And it was a wonderful experience. I mean, I put 100 hours into a 14-minute talk, which was, my friend who helped me with the talk, who had done one, told me I was going to do that. I'm like, come on, no way. And sure enough, I did. But basically, the thesis of that talk was, or as they say in TED, what's your idea worth sharing, which was, just tell your kids you love watching them play. Yeah. And I think that was very sticky, and it went, viral because it's an easy idea to remember. And it's funny still, because I meet people all the time who don't know my name or don't know what I do. And someone will mention it to you and they'll be like, oh, I saw this great TED Talk once where the guy was like, just tell your kids I love watching you play. And so, and again, I don't claim ownership over that basic idea by any means. I think it's in the Bible. And, I've heard someone else say it before I said it. But I think overall, it's just a simple concept, and it was sticky. And I get a lot of emails and stuff still from people who are like, man, I just watched your TED Talk, or organizations that say, you know what, we make all our parents at the beginning of every season watch your TED Talk, because that's what we want from them. Leave your kids alone on the ride home, tell them you love watching them play, take a step back and let the coaches coach.
And that, but also I think the important message there was, for me anyway, certainly where one of the reasons it resonated was to, kind of that, it was that sort of, I think you publicly said what a lot of people were thinking, but maybe were too afraid to, which was to say, why don't we all, as adults, get out of the way of kids having fun in a sports experience? Why are we like getting involved and making it all serious and screaming and shouting and getting super competitive? Why don't we just let's go back to kind of what a child sports experience should look like if we left the kids to their own devices? And yeah. For me, that was very relevant at the time, because I'd probably just started my work within rugby union in England, and we had a very strong kind of ethos and a message around the idea of we were trying to create this concept, and in fact we did create this concept called Kids First, which was, let's create an experience where we put the kids first. And then kind of work backwards from that, and then develop an environment around that. And so it was very useful at the time, actually, to say, look, here's somebody over in America, they've got the same sorts of problems. And I think I probably used your YouTube, your TED Talk clip in a number of different presentations I was giving, to allow others to have that kind of as a good conversation starter. And sometimes I'd send it out beforehand, and then we go for a workshop and say, right, you saw that, what did you think of it? And it stimulates conversation. So it was really, really powerful from that perspective.
Yeah. And I think that the challenge, and I know you face this as well in your day jobs, is this idea that fun, enjoyment, and competing hard are mutually exclusive, right? That you can have one or the other. And I think that's one of the biggest and most damaging myths out there in sport. And one of the things that we do through My Way of Champions podcast or the blogs we write is we bring on coaches that talk about this all the time. If the coaches at the top level, we had Steve Kerr from the Golden State Warriors on, and the number one value of the Warriors is joy. Right? Like, it's got to be fun. It's got to be a great time. And I think this is what's gotten lost in youth sport and teenage sport, is this idea that, oh no, there's no fun here. This is serious. We're competing for a championship, or, these kids are trying to be pros. But I mean, joy's got to be at the center of it, or why would you keep doing it? And I don't know. I just think it's really damaging, and I hope that we've given permission to parents and coaches to let it be fun for their kids. Because if we do, then we're going to have more kids sticking around sports.
Yeah, and and that's the bigger. I guess that's the fear we all have, isn't it? Is that it's really really interesting. I was managed to get away for a weekend recently with a couple of other families, and we went to a kind of like a holiday place they have over here in the UK, where actually a lot of stuff's done indoors, so the weather can't get in the way. We had a brilliant time, but we all went and played tennis, and we were all sort of just playing and and getting involved in this, that, and the other. And then at one stage, two of the children, particularly the two of the younger children, just sort of went off and picked up a phone and then just sat there, kind of looking at a screen or whatever it was. And I remember looking over to myself, and I was like, I mean, they weren't my kids, so I kind of couldn't really do much about it. But I just thought, God, that's powerful, isn't it? Look at the allure. Look how easily they can be dragged to it. Even though we've got some fun stuff happening here and we're having a great time, it's like the attention span on this is like literally gone, and now we've got to get back to the screen. And I think, weirdly, for a little while it was like, we're going to do the screen stuff, then we're going to go off and do something else. Now it's the other way around. We're doing the real life stuff momentarily in between screen time, and that's pretty scary for me.
Yeah, I mean, my God, that's a whole other podcast episode right there, and you always get into murky waters when you talk to people about that stuff, because obviously everyone has their own story of why they do it. But certainly, my wife and I made a choice many years ago. My kids are 12 and 14 right now, and they don't have a phone, right? Mm. They don't have a screen because we see the damage of it. And, last night we had some friends over for dinner. It was Thanksgiving here in the US, and we had some snow, and the kids went out and they were sledding, and then they were like riding snowboards over this box, and then they got a game of American tackle football 2v2 going in the snow. There was no screens anywhere. And I just think if you make the default to a screen so easy, that's what kids are going to default to. Yeah. And it's incredibly damaging. I tell my kids, I'm like, you want to be in a growth industry, be a physical therapist, because everyone's necks are going to be shattered in 15 years here.
I have to say though, from my perspective, one of the things that I think is really interesting is how kind of technology and physical activity are starting to merge together, which is quite interesting. So for example, my son has just gone to high school, and he cycles, and this time of year now it's dark at 4:30, so we didn't really have much choice. We had to give him a phone just so that he can be in contact with us, and all that sort of stuff. Now, of course, I mean, that comes with it. But what was really interesting was he, like a lot of people his age, he spends a little bit of time on it and stuff like that, and we monitor it and all those sorts of things, and we're trying to find the right balance, like a lot of people are. But interestingly, he got up this morning, got himself dressed. He does that anyway. He's pretty good. But he got himself dressed, and he said, "Right, I'm leaving early today." I was like, "Right," because the day before it was a bit horrible. It wasn't very nice weather, and he didn't want to ride his bike. And we were sort of saying, "Hey, mate, you can do it," Yeah. And then, but this morning he was up on his bike and out early. Now that never happens. Normally it's like, have you got your shoes? Have you got your bag? Have you got everything else? Anyway, he's out early. Why? Okay, so the why is because he's now started to play Pokemon Go with his friends, and he wanted to go out and hunt some Pokemon. Now, in my mind, I'm thinking that's really interesting, because actually there's a positive side to that, because he's out now physically active, going out, searching Pokemon. So there's a part of me thinking, I'm not going to get in the way of that. That's pretty cool. And that's kind of merging both worlds. My biggest fear, though, is that my sports experience that I provide is never going to be as appealing as that. But that's why my mission is to help coaches, and this circles around to what we're going to talk about today, is to help coaches try and create an experience that's as cool as a video game, if not cooler. Because I think it should be, and it could be cooler, instead of making it like school, which is how so much of the sport experience has gone.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point. And again, I recognize for sure that in my world, what we're able to do with my kids doesn't necessarily mean that that's what is the best fit for everybody, given my kids' circumstances and stuff like that. But I also, like I said, as at this point coming up where my kids will get phones, it's just going to be like, not in place of sport or activity or raking leaves or shoveling snow or whatever. And I think that's it. And I think your point is exactly perfect. As a coach, whenever I coach, my approach is I want to make this the best, 2 hours of their day. Right. I want this to be engaging and fun and challenging, and it's going to be difficult. But at the same time, if they're not saying, like, I love when at the end of a practice, kids go, "Wait, are we done already?" I'm like, okay, with that one went pretty well.
Right?
Because like it's just flown by for them. But we're playing and we're moving and we're just having a grand old time, and that's it. And there's so many days where I just I look at the faces of the kids as they arrive, or I look at the faces of the kids on fields around mine who are just like, this is just another chore in their long list of chores on the day. And I'm just like, oh man, how can you make this hour a chore? This hour should just be awesome.
Yeah, because they get like just ferried around, dropped off from club to club to club to club, and this is like just one extra thing that they do. And yeah, you're right, exactly. The point being is that if they come there and this is a highlight, then you're on to. I like that actually. By the way, I like that as a coaching KPI. If they say, "Oh, we finished already," like you say, that should be the measure, shouldn't it, of whether you've done a decent session. Forget about. I mean, the improvement stuff comes as a kind of a follow-up
byproduct.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Engagement is the key thing, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And again, it's rarely those sessions of just, again, free play, roll a ball out and let them set up games and play that they're like that. It's actually really well run, organized, games based sessions with a quick progression and lots of activity and of course goals to score and things like that that go by really fast. Those are the ones that are just like boom 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 boom, we're done, and they're like, wait, we're done? And I'm like, yeah, we got to get off the field, another team coming, and they're like, oh god, and I was like, yeah, okay, that was good. Those kids will be back tomorrow.
So the first book was kind of, I guess, quite parent focused, I suppose. Whereas, I haven't even mentioned, you got another book out.
Yeah. Exciting.
Yeah. You've been hard at work, slaving away, doing the second book. You obviously didn't. Is it? I think it must be like running a marathon. I've never done one, but I think it's a bit like running a marathon. I think you did your first book and probably said never again, and now you're doing the second one because you thought it was probably a decent idea, and probably going to say never again, aren't you?
No, I actually won't say that again. I enjoy the process of writing. The difference between the two was when I wrote my book, Changing the Game, I didn't have Changing the Game project. So I didn't really have a day job. I had stepped away from my full-time coaching role and decided to do this. And so I could just kind of write throughout the day, during the day, whenever I felt like it. And so, and I got the book out pretty quick. This go around, I put it off because I'm like, man, I have so much going on between speaking and podcasts and all this other stuff. And so most of this book got written between 4 and 8 a.m. I'd just get up before everyone else and write for a couple hours and get it out. And so it was awesome. But yeah, the new book it's called Every Moment Matters, How the World's Best Coaches Inspire Their Athletes and Build Championship Teams. And I'm really, really excited about this book. I feel like I wrote it at the right time for me. I'm glad I didn't write it 2 years ago because it's filled with insight and wisdom from the podcast, from all these amazing coaches and skill acquisition experts and sports scientists and athletes that we've been able to interview on the podcast, plus a lot of research that I did. A lot of stories that I've heard over the years, and just try to combine them all into a coaching book that covers a lot of things that us coaches don't learn about in coaching school. So there's a chapter on coaching your own child. There's a chapter on the difference between coaching boys and girls, things like that we never get to in our coaching certification because we're dealing with all the other stuff. But, that's the reality on the ground, right? I don't know what the numbers in the UK are, but when I ask a room in the US of coaches, how many of you have coached your own kid, almost everyone raises their hand.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I think it's definitely there's a strong driver there, isn't it? And that's why a lot of people, I think, enter into it is there's no provision currently for their children to participate, so they create a team and start coaching the team, or in some cases their children go along to a session and they go, I could do this better, so they get involved there. There's a whole range of motivations, but there's definitely a strong correlation between and also there's a shelf life. We've actually got some really interesting data on this that's not long come out. There's actually a shelf life, and you see that actually a lot of coaches have a particular shelf life, and it usually lasts about 10 years. And you can sort of see that that's because, maybe they start at 8 and they finish at 18, or they start at 6 and finish at 16. And that tends to be the kind of shelf life of people who coach.
Yeah, no, that's exactly it. I think the number in the US, because we talk about player churn all the time, right? Of, how many kids drop out of sport, and we're talking about losing officials and referees as well. But we're also now talking about, I think the number I heard from the USOC was like 25% of coaches don't come back the next year. Right. So every year we've got 25% new coaches that we really have to get out there and train. And, the data on, the amount of coaches who drop out, or kids who drop out if their coach isn't trained is, it's like 5 times the amount drop out if they do train the coach. So, that new 25% every year, we can't just be like, great, we got enough bodies, let's start the league. It's like, no, we got to train these guys and girls, because, the kids aren't going to come back if we don't.
Interestingly enough, I have exactly the same thing. So twofold. So 60 odd percent, 70 odd percent of our coaches are voluntary, entirely voluntary. But 50%, not just the volunteer coaches, whether they're paid or not, 50% have got no qualification. We've got 2.6 million coaches here in England, and half of them have not been through any formal training. But interestingly, we also asked the question around like how they feel and their likely retention rate. And those who are trained feel far better about their coaching experience than those who don't. And that stands to reason, doesn't it? And that's even with what I consider to be pretty substandard training. So, even with the basics of training, I think it helps. So I would recommend anybody getting involved in that to actually make sure they do that. But then the other thing is it has a massive impact on retention. But where your book is really important, and actually I think where a lot of this work is really important, is, like you say, no amount of, let's face it, right? Coach education is it needs to be seen as basic training. It's not going to teach you, it's never going to be able to teach you everything you need to know about coaching, which is why you need to then learn through experience, but also learn through the experiences of others. Now, back in the day, prior to, Changing the Game project existing, the, Your Way of Champions podcast, my podcast, there's loads of people out there now helping coaches. There's a lot of information for coaches to be able to use to help them get better. And it means that you can learn from others, because prior to all this information being out there, the only way you could learn from others was to be fortunate enough to work with somebody else and then learn from them. Or you just make a lot of trial and error. You make a lot of error probably. And then you find yourself in a difficult situation sometimes. And then that can really affect your motivation because you feel like you're lost. And I talk about that quite a bit. So I think this book's brilliant because, like you say, it's saying, right, this is all the stuff that you've kind of learned through the process that you've been through talking to people on the podcast, et cetera, that nobody will tell you. And this really helps, I think, people to almost shortcut that process of learning. It's not a shortcut, but it certainly helps, because there's bound to be something in here that somebody's experienced something in the book that someone's experienced that will help somebody, they're more than likely going to have that same problem.
Yeah, exactly. And I think you just described it perfectly in that there's no way any coaching certification course or any sort of coaching training is going to, it's a generalist course, right? And so that you're going to get these specific instances where like, whoa, okay, that wasn't in the manual, and I think, and that's, what the way that I wrote Every Moment Matters was, that there's multiple points of entry for this book. So the way I kind of recommend it is go through the whole book, read it, but then you can dive back into specific areas of the book, over and over again. It's not like you have to read the whole thing at once. So you want to come up, how do we come up with our team core values and our DNA, our do not alter? Like, all right, I can jump into that chapter, right? I got to coach my own kid. I can jump into that chapter. How do I find my coaching, purpose or, a higher purpose than winning? I can jump into those chapters. And so I think that's, the way I wanted to create this book was that there was multiple entry points. So it wasn't like you had to read the whole book and then read the whole book again to find that idea. You can just dive right back in, and every chapter ends with activities for promoting whatever the chapter was about. So it's like, okay, here's the story, here's the information, the research, and then here's a couple activities that you can do to engage your team parents, or start a work on the inner game with your team, things like that. Help your kids with their self-talk, all that sort of stuff.
So I want to dive in. I want to dive into a few of these chapters.
Yeah,
because I'm intrigued. Partly because I'm intrigued because I haven't been able to get through it all yet. You were kind enough to send me an advanced copy.
Well, I teased you with the chapter headings.
Yeah, and they're good. I really like them.
So. And you're like, whoa.
Yeah, so I'm going to let you explain some of those because you'll do it better than I can. But the first one that you sort of talked a little bit about there is, kind of what I like about them is like exactly as you've just said, is you can literally go. It's the way you've written them is almost like you're speaking to a pain point that somebody's probably had at some point. So you're likely to be able to go through the chapter
that I've probably had at some point.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. But you're speaking to sort of pain point that somebody can go, that's what I need. So the one I'm going to start with is lesson 4: great on paper, shit on grass. How to design a great practice. Now, the reason I made me think about this is there was a brilliant video on Twitter that I shared that everyone seems to like, which is he's got this little video of a hamster somebody had created this little maze for a hamster, right, with like cardboard, and they put the hamster in thinking the hamster's going to work its way through this maze, and the hamster just climbs over the cardboard and just gets straight to its treat. And somebody had tweeted saying, like, making a reference to practice design. And I'm like, that's like every session I've ever designed, right? Where I think I've got this brilliant practice and the kids just find this way to break it. So there you go. How to design a great practice. I really need you to start there.
Oh, that's awesome. That's a great story. I haven't seen that, but that's like, that is perfect as well. I would say, first of all, just the overall, the title, right? Every Moment Matters is, as coaches, we work, with athletes. Many of us work with children in high school. This is for, any age athlete, right? But
yeah.
It's public, it's emotional. We keep score. And yet today might be that one moment that a kid is going to listen to you. Today might be the one thing that you say to your athlete might be the thing that sticks with them for the rest of their life.
Yeah.
Right. So every moment matters. You always have to bring your A game, and because something you say or do might be with them 30 years from now. And we all have these experiences, coaches. And I always ask coaches this, like, do you remember something that a coach said to you when you were a kid? And everyone raises their hand. I'm like, that's you today. What are you going to remember? And so I think this is such a critical thing. And so this is, really the book was like, well, how do we make every moment matter then? How do we be intentional about these moments? And so, first of all, how to design a great practice. And so each chapter, is titled after a quote from the chapter. And that one was from my friend Chris van der Hagen from the Belgian FA. That's his quote of great on paper, shit on grass. And I think this is one of the things that we deal with as coaches a lot, is that we look at these great training sessions that, we see Pep Guardiola run, and we go, I'm just going to do that with my 10-year-olds because look at Pep doing it with Man City, right? And, it looks fantastic on paper, but it doesn't work with the people who are in front of me. Yeah. And so really what, I talk about in that chapter is, what is a good training session design, and how I think, first of all, number one, if you're working with young children, a whole or practice play, I don't know what you call it in the UK, is one of the best ways to design a training session, right? So, great on paper, bad on grass is the session that I was taught in coaching school 20 years ago, where, you start small and you give every kid a ball, and then you build it up, and maybe at the end you get to a game. Yeah. Well, that's not realistic when you're coaching 9-year-olds and they're getting dropped off early, on time, and late, and you're trying to do an activity in the beginning of practice, and kids are showing up late, and then you're just trying to re-explain the activity over and over and over and over. Plus they showed up to play, plus their parents gave them lots of sugar in the car, and they've been sitting in a classroom all day long, right? And so now you're going to tell them to stand in line? Like, give me a break, right? Get them there, hand them a bib, and let them play, because that's why they signed up. Yep. Right. And even, with the older kids that I coach, in soccer, we do rondos, like, show up and get a little rondo going, have some fun, nutmeg a few people, keep them in the middle, have a good laugh. But, they don't warm up for recess. They don't need a warm up when they're kids. I'm not saying we go out and we start sprinting around the field, but they'll manage their body. They know how fast they can go. And then you can break it down, and then you play again at the end. And I think when you do that, it gets people engaged, it burns off the sugar, and, they start showing up on time and early because they know they're going to play first. Yeah. Right. So I think that's one of, if you're coaching just in general, 12 and unders, right? Can you play first? And maybe this doesn't work in swimming, but certainly, in you coach hockey and cricket and, soccer, whatever, like, yeah, let them play, break it down, let them play. I think it's a great approach to training design.
And then there's then lots of lovely like build-ons from that as well, which is let them play, then let them play in a slightly different way, let them play in a slightly different way. And so the way I've started to do that, or the way I've been doing that for a while now, is to, instead of because you go to whole part whole. So what that sometimes is a little bit is you get a bit of dessert, then you have to eat your vegetables, and then you get a bit of dessert. Mm-hmm. So the way I've tried to do it is to try and I talk about broccoli burgers. So you want something that sort of tastes good, but is also nourishing. Mm-hmm. So I've sort of tried to make it so that you go, start with a game, modify the game slightly, modify the game a little bit more, modify the game a little bit more, and they're still playing the game or a version of the game, and then you kind of come back to the original game. So it never really feels like they've gone from the whole to the part. It just feels like they've had slight modifications that eventually take them to the part and then back out to the whole. Mm-hmm. So that's just a variation on that I think is quite an interesting way of doing things.
Yeah, and I think, your food analogy is like we're adding a little extra salt and butter to each activity, right? Bingo, tastes a little better, tastes a little better, tastes a little better. And that's it. And so then I think also, what I like to use the golf analogy of, and maybe this is changing in this day and age where people can hit it 400 yards. And so, the Brooks Koepkas of the world, they just go hit it and go find their ball. But back in the day when you had to be clever about your shot making, right? As the best golfers, they start at the end. They're like, where do I want to putt from? Therefore, in order to put the ball there, what club do I want to hit to the green? Therefore, what do I need to hit from the tee so I can hit that club to the green and be there, right? So they begin at the end. And so I think a lot of coaches just throw together activities and hope it all makes sense at the end. But if we really say, what do we want to accomplish? What do we want it to look like on Saturday? And then building backwards from there, what are the activities that I can plug into this practice that are going to get me to that? And I think these are the things that if we do that, then good things happen. So we begin at the end of what's it supposed to look like in the game. What are the activities that we can work on to accomplish that bit? And then, for me as well, are we layering in the values that we want to teach through sport, and also the things like, you've had Rusty and Fletch on your podcast as well, where are the cards things, right? Is there opportunity for self-organization and creativity and decision-making and all that sort of stuff in this practice? Like, I think that's what a great practice looks like right there, that it has all these elements that gets us towards this bigger thing. But if it doesn't have defenders, if it doesn't have decisions, if it doesn't have direction, there's no transfer. And I think I see lots and lots of practices going on out there still to this day without transfer.
Yeah, and I think that the ironic thing is that the practices that don't transfer are the most boring ones in general.
Exactly. Yeah, they're the most boring because they don't look like the game.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so I think this is, there's another chapter there where I talk about the principles of learning. But I think the subheading of that one is, how to turn technique into skill. And I've heard you rant on this many times on your podcast. And, if technique is the ability to perform a task, and still is, and skill is deploying it in the environment, right? Mm-hmm. And I see lots of technical practices with no skill development.
Yeah.
And so I really think coaches have to understand that, and we have to break this myth that, they can't do the game-like thing until they've broken this down into its component parts. And it's just not true.
Mm. And what I like about the title of that chapter is, and this one jumped out at me as well, is you can't practice in a kind world if you compete in a wicked one.
Yeah. And that was I first came across that in David Epstein's book, Range. That's research from a guy named Robin Hogarth. And he talks about, right, a kind world is like chess, right? A very closed system. You get immediate feedback on what you do. There's similar repeating patterns. And a wicked world is hockey or soccer, right? Where you never play the same pass twice. Everything's moving and changing. And it's very, very dynamic, and there's not necessarily immediate feedback, or the immediate feedback that you get might actually be misinformation. And so most of us coach, if we think of a kind to a wicked world as a spectrum, right? Our sport falls somewhere along that spectrum, and swimming might be a little less wicked than hockey, but it doesn't mean there's not dynamic elements within swimming. Or, I think a lot of times we think of golf as a very kind sport, but really it's not. I remember, Ian Renshaw was telling me how, they took pro golfers and they put those full body suits on them that measure their exact, motion. And they went and hit 10 7-irons on the range, and they were able to swing exactly the same time 10 times. And then they had them hit 10 7-irons on the golf course from different lies with different pin angles, and they had 10 completely different swings. Right. And so it's like, if you are hitting off the range all the time, that is not mimicking the golf course.
Yeah.
Right. And so I think we have to think about this. The more wicked our sport is, the more wicked our practice has to be.
I totally agree. And I loved, actually, I thought David's book is fantastic, by the way. I thought the Sports Gene was really good, but Range, I think, is even better. And I think this idea of the wicked, he talks about the wicked problem, and he's talking a lot about, sort of the complexity of human interaction in society being often being a wicked problem when you're trying to bring about change, but sport mimics that, doesn't it? Like you say, because you have these dynamic, challenging, ever-changing environments that are essentially, present wicked problems to athletes, because there's moments in time when a ball arrives at their feet and there are two defenders converging on them from different angles, and they are probably never likely to have experienced that before. They certainly won't have experienced that if they've been practicing in an environment that didn't involve those two defenders converging from one scenario. So they're never necessarily going to experience the same thing twice, but what you want them to do is to experience similar things, so that they've got they develop a way of approaching a problem like that may end up with them being able to solve it in faced with similar circumstances, and therefore exposure to scenarios that are similar to that is essential. So anybody who thinks that you can develop skillful performance by doing things in isolation and on the basis that you think that they're going to transfer, in my opinion, I think that's just a bit of a fool's errand.
Right, exactly. And what's really interesting, and the challenge is this, and so what we're now talking about is blocked practice or massed practice versus interleaved practice. Is the challenge is that in the short term, when you mass your practice, the athletes will actually perform better, right? If you just sit there and pass a ball back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, they'll actually improve that, but it's not sticky learning, right? It's not sticky learning, right? And if learning is not supposed to be just, can I do it now, but can I retrieve this later on? We want sticky learning. And the research around this that's troubling that we need to think about as coaches is that oftentimes it's that frustration in learning, like I'm not quite getting it because this is hard in their stretch, that makes it easier to retrieve later on in the game. And when they survey people learning something, the actual learners say, oh yeah, in this mass practice, I learned better, right? So 80% of them will say, I learned it better, but then when they get tested on it, they're actually all wrong, that they learned it better in the interleague practice. So convincing our kids, and if we're working with kids, convincing their parents that actually ugly is good, is one of our biggest challenges as coaches, because parents, wow, look at those cones, look at those lines, look at that slick little passing pattern, right? And wow, the boys really look great today, versus, wow, that's messy and they're really struggling with it. But on Saturday, over time, the messiness will lead to better performances if we keep doing it. Now, this doesn't mean that we're disorganized in practice, right? We're making it ugly with some thought behind the ugliness.
Yeah, and that's an important point to make, because if it's just ugly, then it can be too ugly, can't it? So it's it's what they call the challenge point theory, isn't it? It's about getting the or Vygotsky talks about the zone of proximal development, doesn't he? It's this idea that you've got to make it just stretching enough, and that does, you have to be intentional in the design of that, and you also have to be adaptable and flexible, because rarely, in my experience, do I ever get that right first time. It's usually slightly too stretching or slightly not stretching enough. So you have to have an idea in your mind of how you can adapt and amend in order to create that right stretch point. And sometimes that's a feel thing. I'd love to be able to say to somebody, just do this or just do that. There are certain things that you can do. There are modifications that you can make that work, but in general, it's a feel thing. And you have to be very intuitive. Your observation skills have to be very high. You have to be really good listener. You have to be able to kind of tune into where the athletes are in terms of the stretch level, in order to be able to then just tweak it that little bit. And that's a constant, I describe it, it's a bit like being a DJ, you're like it's like you've got a mixing desk. You're constantly mixing the dials to be able to, or twisting the dials or sliding in order to find just the right blend to create that sweet music.
And that's the art of coaching right there. And this is why you and I never say the X's and O's don't matter, because the more of that stuff that you know, the more creative you can be in that session, right? And you're the master coach is the one who is able to recognize, well, why isn't this working? Right. And what's the tweak? Is it space? Is it time? And like you just said, how can that change over time as well? Right. If I, add a neutral player here, does that make a difference? I've done the same activity at the same field with the same group, and it doesn't work because the grass is longer 3 days later. Right. Yeah. And all of a sudden it's not working. We have to change the space because the grass is thick and the ball's not whizzing around, and so, I mean, these are the things that as a coach, the more experience you have, you're looking at your plan and you're realizing what has to change here. And then for me personally, and I'm not saying this is for everybody, I'm one of those coaches that I come up with a plan, but I love everyone to be playing. And so if my plan calls for some game that's, 7v7 plus 1, to goal, and I've got 18 kids there, I change the numbers.
Yeah.
Because I want everyone playing, right? And so maybe it's 8 aside plus 2 or something like that. Like, I don't like anyone sitting out unless the numbers are so big that it just doesn't fit the space and whatever. But so I'm always tweaking my game, and so I work in the club I work with. I always get because of my travel schedule, I coach 2 teams, but then I have a young coach who will do like a mentorship year with me. Then they'll work side by side with me for a year, and then they move on to their own teams. And so when I'm sending them the practice plan, I'm like, in general, this is about what we're going to do today. And then they're like, wow, we didn't do any of that. And it's like, well, here's why, here's why, or, so that's the art of coaching right there.
And that is going back to that point about mentoring. That's why I think mentoring is so important, because it's very difficult to learn that on a course. It's very difficult to learn that from a book in many ways. What you need to do is take the ideas from the book, and then with an individual could take an idea here and then play it out, and then with somebody else by their side, either going, oh yeah, what if you did this? Or they could come to you and say, it's not really working, is it? What would you do here? And then you might be able to offer a suggestion. That then sort of turbocharges what they might have learned through some of this. Again, it can be done through trial and error, but if you've got somebody with you, that can be really powerful, I imagine.
Yeah, and I think also because of the way that you like to coach, because of the way I like to coach, and there's a lot of thought and evidence behind it. Again, sticky learning is slow learning, so it's not always evident right away. And I had the coach I worked with this past fall, great guy, very good player, had coached for a while, and he said, I want to spend a season and do this. And sort of at the end of the season, he's like, I can't believe how much better technically our players are, and we never once did what I would have considered technical training work, right? Everything was, even if it was a 3v1 or a 4v1 rondo, our passing came in something like that, and again, it's not that we never pulled a kid aside and said, hey, you're not locking your ankle, here's how to hit a ball. But you don't see it right away like you would do if you did a technical session over and over and over, and you'd see this clean thing. But everyone in a game like football looks better if they learn how to find space, right? And so the way we train is we're teaching kids to find space, and if they're finding an extra yard of space, then their first touch is always going to look a little bit better because they're not going to lose the ball on it. And it was if this was just him sent out to do this, he would have defaulted to the norm. But after 5 months, he's like, wow, I can really see the difference now that wasn't immediately evident after a month or after 2 months or something like that. And so I think having a senior experienced coach really helped him change the way that he'll teach from here on out.
I tell you what, that's a really good point, right? Because it's pretty scary to do this on your own. And in many ways, I've been in that boat with the teams I've been coaching for the past 4 or 5 years, because I've had them since they were, 7 or 8, and we've done loads and loads of games, loads and loads of different game forms, and I kind of know what I know, but other people around me don't know the same stuff, and so they're a bit like, shouldn't we do some technique work? Or they'd say skill work and mean technique work. And I've also
Let's talk about that word, yeah.
And I've also got I've had a new coach come and join me, who retired from playing a number of years ago, played at a very high level, played internationally as a junior international, and his coaching experience was very much about repetition and drilling. And he obviously got to international standard doing so. And he's coming to coach with me, and he's got his little boy coming along, and I'm sort of talking to him quietly, slowly, about introducing some of these ideas and concepts. And he goes, man, this is a whole new world. This is like, I have to completely change my mindset about how to approach this particular problem. I've got to almost got to start from scratch. Everything I've learned before, I kind of almost need to put away. And he's really interested and actually very curious about the approach and the way to kind of tackle the problem. But at the same time, I can sometimes see him going, I just want to show him what to do. Mm-hmm. It's pretty powerful driver, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. You just had John Kessel on your podcast, and I don't remember if John repeated this on your podcast, but I've heard it. He said it to me before: is show him where to look, not what to see.
Oh, that's a
right.
Good one. Yeah.
And I really, really like that. It's such a great approach. And again, it doesn't mean that there's never a time or a place to pull someone out and say, try this, right? Or hey, you're not locking your ankle, or but there's ways to do it, right? Where, like a lot of kids, when they're learning to hit a football with their laces, will hit the outside of the ball because their plant foot's too close to the ball. And so instead of saying, move your plant foot from the ball, you can say something like, hey, try to hit a ball where your plant foot's, way far from the ball, and it opens up their hip. And then all of a sudden they hit it well. And they're like, wow, see that? Now try to stand too close to the ball, see what happens. Right. Or different thoughts. So they just, how does that feel when you hit it that way? To get them thinking about it and doing it. Like, I just finished my season and had, I just did player evaluations with all the kids that I coach, and I won't meet with a player until they do a self-evaluation. Right. So I'm like, you have to think about your game, what's going well, what's not working, and, technically and tactically and all this sort of stuff. And then we'll sit down. But I want you to think about your own game. I'm not just, you're not just going to come in there and listen to me talk at you. You need to examine what's going well for yourself and what needs work for yourself. Because if you can't do it, who cares what I tell you? Right? You've got to be able to break this down yourself. And it's funny because parents are like, wow, no one's ever asked my kid to do that before.
That's a fundamental thing, isn't it? You've got to understand where they're coming from first, haven't you? You've got to get the information from them first, and then you can start to play back to them whether whether what you're seeing is the same as what they think they're seeing or they're experiencing or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. And again, let's go back to video games, right? When I can't get past this level, they do some self-examination. Well, why can't I? Because I'm not getting enough energy capsules to get past this guy, or I need to go get this bomb. And so they self-evaluate and solve the problem. But yet in sport, they're looking to the sideline for all the answers. And we have to sometimes throw it back at them. It's in you, figure it out.
And video games are great for that in many ways, because if my kids come to me with a video game problem, I'm like, I don't know. I can't help you with that. So they got no choice. The adults can't help them. So actually, that's actually another good kind of video game based lesson. It's one of the things I like about Amy Price's research, around the video games approach. Because if you were to take a video games approach, then one of the things that you would know is, firstly, the solution is there. You can find it, but also they, because the designer wouldn't have made it, so it's so hard, because otherwise they know that people will give up playing. But also the fact that the self-directed learning element is an absolutely essential part of a video game. And again, this comes back to your point around providing an environment where self-directed learning can take place.
Yeah, exactly. And that's really the only way that takes place is us as coaches take a step back. We bite our tongue. We create the space and the patience for learning. Trevor Reagan says it best, Train Ugly and Learner Lab podcast. He says, don't steal the reps. Don't steal the reps. Is like, if you're in the weight room and you do the first 3 and then you're starting to struggle, if, your spotter comes and takes the bar off your shoulders and does, number 4 through 8, you're not getting any better. Right. And sometimes as coaches, we're stealing the reps, and we have to take a step back, and, we can spot. We can be there, so the bar doesn't crush them, but they got to do it. And in those last couple, when there's real struggle, that's where the magic happens. That's where you build muscle, and that's where the learning happens. And so in our desire to get a result today, in our desire to see it look good, oftentimes as coaches, we steal the reps. And, this is hard. And I would say I struggle with it as well, right? Because I just want to solve this so we can get on with practice. Right. And forcing myself to bite my tongue and say, no, we're not moving on. Solve the problem. Why isn't this working? Right.
Now, interestingly, so that's lesson 8, don't steal the reps. There's another couple of bits and pieces in here that I just want to just drill into as well, which is you talk about, one of the interesting ones is you are enough. So it's helping athletes overcome fear. Talk to me about that, because this is something I think is very prevalent for me at the moment. Yeah.
So the story behind the title on that one is the all-time winningest collegiate field hockey coach in the U.S., a woman named Nancy Stevens. That's her story of, having a very good team, very young team, feeling a lot of pressure to win a national championship, and she could just see it in them. And so she went into the locker room as the season was starting and wrote on the mirror, "You are enough," right? You are enough. And we have kids who live in this world where social media and everything's public and everything's, you're comparing how you feel inside to how everyone else looks outside, and that you're carrying around this huge burden. And she wanted to get across to her team, you are enough, right? You have it within you. And, they went through a whole season undefeated and then got to the Final Four. And again, she's got all these freshmen and young players, and they're playing a really experienced team. And she said everything kind of crept back in of, we haven't lost. We don't know if we're good enough to do this. And she said, she just walked in the locker room and said, you are enough, right? You are enough. As human beings, you are enough. It is within you. And she said, I'm not going to say that that's why we won, but she says it certainly contributed to it. It takes the burden off. And so, I think so many of our kids that we coach are feeling tremendous stress and anxiety and pressure, whether it's from their parents, whether it's from their coaches. And one of the things that we have to do as coaches is remove that. We have to remove this sort of interference that affects their potential in a negative way. And so whether that's, teaching them positive self-talk, this guy, Jim Taylor, says, I quote him in that chapter as well. I think he says, children become the messages they hear the most. Right. And so whatever we're saying to them over and over as parents or as coaches, that's the little voice in their head right before that crux moment, right? When they're taking that penalty shot, right? When they're about to dive into the pool. What's that message, right? What's that message? What are they saying to themselves in that moment? And if we're not intentional about teaching them to shape that in a positive way, then, we're sending a less than prepared athlete out there.
Yeah. And I think that's the important thing around this about fear for me. I think, again, it links back a little bit to what you were saying earlier about practicing in a kind world. Because if part of the fear comes from, for example, they think they might not be able to perform, under the pressure of competition. Well, that's why, in my view, it's really important to expose them to an environment that is as close to that pressureful environment as possible, because otherwise it shouldn't be a surprise, should it, if they aren't able to perform under the pressure of the competitive environment if they haven't been exposed to an environment that is something like that. And in many ways, that's one of the reasons I love the idea of Train Ugly, because that's an environment that is full of challenge and difficulty and failure. Therefore, that becomes the norm, which is pretty much what it's going to be like on the weekend, isn't it? Or whenever you play your matches. It's going to be challenge, difficulty, and failure. So, and it's just about dealing with that and continuing and persevering. And that's the important thing. And when you get used to that idea, then you're in great shape. But I think a lot, like you say, stealing the reps is another good example as well, because a lot of coaches are kind of too quick to kind of they jump in and go, right, this is too difficult. They're struggling a little bit. Right, I've got to change it, make it easier, Actually, that might just be the moment that you've got to stay there, because there's value in the struggle, as Carol Dweck once said to me.
Yeah. No, exactly. And I think, as the coach, you're always navigating that boundary between too hard and not hard enough, right? And you're always, if you think of it as like the ceiling, you're always bouncing on the ceiling and seeing where we can go over. And yeah, certainly if we want athletes to be confident, well, confidence comes from knowing that you're prepared and from doing the work. And so if I've seen this over and over, then I'm going to be confident. And when I coach teams, I recently in June of this year took over a boys group, which is my son's group. And I said, our first couple of months, what we're working on is getting better at practice, right? Mm-hmm. We're not good enough at practicing yet. It's not focused. It's not competitive enough. So once we get good at practice, you'll start to see the results in the games. But we're not just going to get better at games. We got to get better at practice. And one of the coaches I interviewed for the book, Anson Dorrance, is just fascinating. He's won 22 national titles as a collegiate soccer coach at North Carolina. He was the head coach for the U.S. women's team, won the 1991 World Cup. So this is a guy who's had a tremendous amount of success. And what he calls it at Carolina is creating the competitive cauldron. Right, that if we make this practice environment so competitive, the games get easy, right? Yeah. If practice is the hardest part of your week, that's it. And for so many, athletes out there, practice is easy and the games are way too hard. And so I think that's where it starts. And if you're like, man, practice here is so hard, then there's not a lot of fear around the games, because you're like, oh, we're ready for this.
That's so difficult to do, and that's actually, I think, a brilliant lesson that, again, never been taught that on any coach education course, which is, and I think maybe the simplest way for me to describe that is how to stay the course. So, for example, you're saying, right, first couple of months, we're just going to learn how to practice. We're going to get better at practice. Then we can begin to actually do the work. But until we've got better at our approach to practice, there's actually no point trying to do the work, because we won't actually make any progress, or as much progress as we could. So, but very few people would be prepared to do that, because they'd see that as, oh God, that's a bit tough. Oh, maybe that's a little bit difficult. Oh no, well, we've got to, that does. By the way, you doing that doesn't have to be the expense of them having a great time. The two things are not diametrically opposed. You can get them to be better at practice, and they'll have a whale of a time doing it.
Especially, I'm working with 11 and 12-year-old boys. That's like the most motivated, competitive. They compete for everything, right? Like, let's get water. They sprint. Who's going to get there first? Who gets back to me first? Right. It's like, so competitiveness is not something that's the antithesis of what they want or makes it fun. It actually makes it more fun. So, and then again, you create this environment where, right, being focused, showing up on time, having your ball pumped up, listening when the coach is talking, working hard, being accountable. These things aren't things that you talk about anymore because they just happen, because the environment forces these behaviors, right? And now we're getting into, obviously, Mark Bennett, who's been on both your and my podcast a couple times, and I write about his work in the book as well. Of if we get the behaviors right, then the performance will happen, right? And the younger the kids that we're working with, the more it's about getting the behaviors right over and over and over. That's our job, is that these kids, when they leave us and move on to another coach, all these high performing behaviors are instilled in them. That's what's going to drive their success later on.
Yeah, 100%. And I think it's important actually to get those dynamics absolutely right. And what people I don't think they appreciate is that getting those behaviors right, getting that kind of cultural environment. And it's interesting. I talk about it from a perspective of kind of being a tribe. A tribe needs people to come together and give of themselves in order for the tribe to succeed. And so in order to do that, the tribe needs, whether they're unspoken or they're explicit, usually explicit rules as to what is acceptable. They need cultural norms, and without those cultural norms, the tribe fractures, and then it doesn't succeed. And then they have big problems in a survival context. Yeah. So what we're building as a team is creating a tribe, and we've got to establish what the cultural norms of the tribe are, and also we need to establish ways in which the members of the tribe can challenge when they feel that those cultural norms are being violated by somebody, because that's not something that young people these days are very used to doing either. They're sort of challenging directly. And so finding a way to make that a safe space for that to happen, what that then does in itself is then the youngsters then begin to own their tribe, and then becomes like ridiculously powerful then. And you've got it when they're calling each other out, they're engaging with each other, they're addressing problems, they're solving problems, they're on the fly, they're in the moment, and you to a degree you're not redundant. But I know Mark talks about making yourself redundant. You're not redundant, but you're not needed for that anymore. You can direct your attention elsewhere and find the other areas and opportunities for learning.
Yeah. I think my proudest moment this fall with my boys group was my club coaching director was watching our match, and we were playing really, really well, which was great. But the kids switched the formation on the fly, right? They just switched it, and he's watching. He's like, "Hey, did you guys playing differently here? Like, he's up there now." He goes, "Did you do that?" I'm like, "No, they just did it on their own." And he's like, "Oh, okay." And I was like, "Yeah, they have permission to do that. If they see something out there that they think they can take advantage of, right? They can, they're welcome to, I have 3 guys that will play this position throughout the game, and they can just switch, right? And they can do that. And I want them to look for these opportunities of how are we going to solve this problem, or where's a matchup that we can exploit. And if they feel like, hey, we need to, change the formation or change the personnel without me making a substitution, then they're allowed to do that, And it's funny because in this game, it actually, it didn't, we were winning, but we stopped playing well when one guy went into this spot and another guy moved out of it because he brought different characteristics. And I said, yeah, we'll just talk about that at halftime, because that one didn't work in our favor. But he was just like stunned. He's like, wow, you guys just switched the formation. The kids just did. I'm like, yeah, they're more intelligent than you think.
And they will do that because they're recognizing. What's interesting is my son plays in a football team I'm not the coach of, but I know the coach really well, and we talk a lot, and we work together, and he's very much built into the idea of sort of self-organization, and he also really buys into kind of the FA philosophy of players playing in different positions. But one of the things that he struggles with is the players are actually sort of, because they have the permission to do so, but also they're sort of tactically astute enough, they begin to recognize where the problems are, and so they naturally almost flow into certain areas in order deal with the problems that the opponents are presenting, and they do have a lot of problems because they're often outclassed in their environment, so they're struggling usually to sort of survive, and they're under a lot of pressure. And so what's interesting is, although he changes the positions, and they tend to sort of gravitate to other positions, but the only problem with that is that if that's done unintentionally, which it sometimes is, then they don't always tell each other what's happening. So they might end up with 6 at the back and nobody in front, or they might end up with 3 players playing in midfield, and whoever was supposed to be in central defence has gone, and now they're massively exposed behind because they haven't quite got the full tactical awareness to be able to cover for each other. They're just kind of responding on the fly as individuals. So the next evolution for him is for them to begin to respond on the fly as a group.
Yeah, exactly. And again, we have certain ways that we're going to do things, and so they're responding within a structure, right? It's not just where we're throwing out the baby with the bathwater here. Like, we're going to do this within a structure of that, looking at how the other team's playing, looking at where are we compared to them. Right. If we're like, hey, we need to go get a goal, we know that we're just going to go match up across the field, and we're going to go, 1-on-1. So we're going to end up with, 4 forwards playing against their 4 backs, and let's just try to win some individual battles and whatever, and, again, these are things that I want players to recognize and see this later on as they grow as players. And I'm also coaching future coaches too, I hope, right? So that they'll coach this way as well, and give their players autonomy and some freedom and problem solving ability out there. And again, so many problems in a wicked game like football happen on the fly. If they have to turn to the sideline to solve it, the ball's already in the back of your net.
Yeah. Now, I know Mark Bennett talks about the rule of 3, but you talk about the rule of 1. What's all that about?
So the rule of 1 is a word that Jerry Lynch and I use to talk about one person, one comment, one time can change a life, right? Okay. So our ability as coaches, and I kind of talked about this in the beginning with this whole idea that every moment matters, right? If we are intentional about giving and affirming, catching a kid being good, that can stick with him forever. And I tell the story in the book about how, my big rule of 1 moment, why this book exists, is because I had in high school an English teacher who gave me an F on a paper and kicked me out of class and said, don't come back until you write a good paper, because you are a great writer. Right. And that stuck with me for the rest of my life. And I'm a great writer. I can do this. And so I can picture that classroom. I know what it smells like. I know exactly what it looked like. That was a sticky moment. And so if we're intentional as coaches about these moments, these moments of pride, these moments of elevation, these moments of, when it's, when a kid is really ready to learn, and we give them that comment, that little positive thing, or, what did you learn from this? You ask them that really poignant question that can stick with them forever. And, we all probably have those rule of 1 moments from a sport perspective or an education perspective. And we just have to recognize our influence. We have to recognize how powerful it can be. And so, one of the things that I work on with, the coaches that I work with is, throughout practice, am I getting a comment to each kid? Am I showing him that, hey, I see you out there? At the end of practice, in my debrief, I always think about, what did I miss out there today? And, maybe I was really harsh on a kid and I shouldn't have been, or maybe, there was a kid who was just fantastic today and I wanted to say something to him afterwards, but then 3 other kids asked me a question before I knew it, he was gone. Can I send him a note, right? I send him a little note through, our team communication tool, and it's like an email that goes to his parents, and it says, for Stuart. And so they read it, But it's like, hey, Stuart, didn't catch you at the end of practice today, but I just wanted to say, I noticed how hard you've been working on X, Y, and Z, and it's really starting to show. And I think today was one of your best practices. Keep up the great work. That can sustain that kid for the next month. Right. And so that's the rule of one person, one comment, one time. Right. The more of those you can dish out, and they have to be authentic. They have to be real. But the more of those you can dish out, the more, inspired and empowered your players are going to feel.
That's my current personal challenge, my personal work on,
to catch each kid.
Catch each kid. Everyone, in the group, everyone gets one moment where I, make an affirmation. And the reason I've used the word affirmation actually relates to podcast which will be last week's podcast by the time this one comes out, with Stephen Rolnick talking about motivational interviewing. And he talks about the idea of using an affirmation as opposed to praise. And what you've just described in the little note that you would have sent is an affirmation, because what you're saying, you're affirming kind of an observation of their behavior, as opposed to just saying that was great, that was brilliant, that was excellent, brilliant, amazing, you're doing brilliant, all those sorts of things, which are kind of a bit meaningless and pointless. And you probably think that that's a great thing, and that doesn't resonate in the same way as you saying what I saw you do and the way I saw you do it and the approach that you took to that. I think you should be proud of that, and that's something I've noticed that you're doing. Do more of that. That's a very different kind of approach.
Or even saying, I saw I saw that you were frustrated out there today, right? Don't get your head down. You've made great progress. And sometimes we just all have that day where things are not working. Don't worry about it. Keep working hard, right? And that as well can sustain a kid. Or, the kid that, didn't play. I mean, I, just had a thing where we had 2 of our 3 goalkeepers get injured, and I had to put this kid in goal, and just send him a note after saying, hey, I know you don't love being in goal, but I really appreciate you stepping up and doing it. And the team appreciates it as well. And the next practice, he's like, hey coach, thanks for that. That really meant a lot. This kid's 11, right? And he sees it. And he feels it, right? And by the time he said that to me, I had forgotten I sent the note to him.
I have this at work at the moment. It's amazingly powerful, right? So we've got a new CEO. I say new. He's been with us about a year, and made a massive change, cultural change. But each week he writes kind of like I guess it's a bit like a blog really, but it's basically an email to the whole business saying this is what happened this week, and these are the things I've been doing. And he usually kind of mentions people that he's sort of interacted with, whether they did a presentation or something along those lines. And this week I got mentioned, and it's great. I mean, it's a silly little thing, right? But it does matter. It really matters. So, just having somebody recognizing, what you did is, kind of cool.
Hey, I was in Beijing listening to your podcast with John Kessel, and you guys mentioned my name. I was like, hey, all right. And I ran a little faster on the treadmill.
Yeah, so I mean, it's amazing, isn't it? You just get just that little bit of recognition, and it's the recognition, isn't it? Yeah. Somebody recognizing something about what you're doing, and that creates a connection, and that's such a powerful thing. But in my view, rarely done, isn't it? Really rarely done.
As coaches, and again, you just said it, and I think anyone listening, when you get recognized at your place of work, it feels good, right? Mm-hmm. So this is what young athletes, this is what any athlete is craving, right? Even professional athletes crave recognition. Human beings crave recognition. And so we can, and I really I look forward to that podcast of the difference between a praise and affirmation, because praising sometimes can become a little bit false, right? Or unauthentic if all you're looking to do is praise, praise, praise. But if you're just affirming that again, this idea of I see you, that's a really powerful thing.
Yeah. And it kind of circles back a little bit back to what we were talking about earlier on about education, because I think actually a lot of coach education is where we're taught about. I certainly was. It may have changed now, but you're taught about technique. Really, you're taught about the techniques of the game, and you're kind of taught to correct them.
Yeah.
And so a lot of our time spent being, is correcting, instead of. I mean, I'm trying to think what the alternative is, but I think we've got to move away from being there to correct to being there to kind of, like you say, catch them being good, affirm when they're good, tell everybody why that was good. And actually that becomes a really powerful thing as well, doesn't it? When a group recognize that we want to do more of that. So they start to do more of that.
Well, how many times as a coach have you been about to intervene and correct because they did the exact wrong thing at the wrong time, and then next thing you know, it ends up as a goal?
Yeah.
And you're like, and you're like, okay, well, and then what do? Stop. Well, you scored, but you didn't do what I said to do. And it's like, the kid's like, but we scored.
Yeah.
Isn't that the point? Isn't that the point? Yeah. So again, I really do think, coaching, it's an art, and the more you know and understand about, about human beings in front of you, right? I mean, one of the chapter titles is, to take Martin Tom's quote, you coach a child, not a sport. You coach a person, not a sport, right? And if I understand who's in front of me and what their basic needs are, and then I build my sporting environment around what they need from me, it's going to be more engaging. It's going to be a better learning environment. And, it's going to be athlete centric and not coach centric, which I think is really, really important.
John, hey, I know that's just a tip of the iceberg in terms of the content of the book, but I guess it part of this serves to get people curious so that they want to kind of get hold of it and find out more of the fabulous nuggets that are held in behind. So I make no apologies for doing that, because obviously we wouldn't want to give away all the secrets. Firstly, when is the book out? When and how can people get hold of it?
Yeah, so December 10th is the date that we're hoping for. I know a lot of your listeners are in the UK, so that's the US release date, and I know you'll at least be able to pre-order by then. And I did this one, through Amazon. So just go to Amazon, was it .co.uk or whatever, or Amazon.com. That's where you'll find it. It'll be on my author page with my other books as well. But yeah, every moment matters. And then if you want a signed copy, just come to Changing the Game Project. That's the mothership, and you should have some signed copies there that I'll do. But I want everyone to be able to get it for the holidays this year. That's the deadline that my editor and I have been pushing for this go around here. So I'm super excited for this book. I really, hopefully, maybe get to come back on another time and chat about it after you've read through it a little more and stuff like that. And it's funny because as you're going through the titles, all I'm thinking is, man, I sent you that table of contents a while ago, because some of those aren't even chapters anymore.
So, but I imagine they're still themes.
They're themes. Yeah, they're chapters that got combined. We didn't talk about anything that's not in the book. Yeah, that's great though. So, but Stuart, thanks for having me on, and thank you for all the work you do. I am serious that I listen to your podcast every week, and I've been introduced to so many amazing coaches and work of people that have subsequently come on my podcast, or I've bought their books and learned from them. I think you do an incredible job, and I'm honored to call you a friend.
Likewise, John. The feeling is entirely mutual, and in many ways, I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing if it wasn't for you, because you were a big part of the inspiration.
Yeah, well, I mean, people ask, why'd you start a podcast? And I always say it started with myself, you, and Nick Levette sitting around in Oxford one day, 3 hours over a couple of beers, and we finished and we're like, we should have recorded that. I think you and I both at that moment were like, huh. there's something here to this, right?
I'm fed up of having these conversations that are absolutely amazing and not getting them, not sharing them. Yeah.
And not sharing them. And hey, I'd also say to your listeners, right, if they want to follow up on any of this, they can just email me, John, JOHN at changingthegameproject.com too. I'm happy to answer their emails and questions directly as well. Awesome
stuff, John. Been great to catch up. Great to chat with you once again. And I do hope you can either stave off the impending sickness, because obviously, maybe the silver lining might be that you get it now instead of getting it at Christmas, because that's usually what happens to me. So if it is now, then hey, that's at least probably better than in a few weeks' time.
Yes, I hear you. Hopefully I'll be through it by then. Thanks, man. Appreciate it.
John, thanks a lot.
Thanks, Tim.
Thanks for listening to the Talent Equation podcast. If you like the show, then please consider supporting it by leaving a review on your favorite podcast player, telling your friends about it, or even becoming a hero and show your appreciation by becoming a patron. Just head over to thetalentequation.co.uk and click on the Becoming a Patron button at the top of the page.